All right, folks, if you haven't found a seat yet, I'm going to ask you to do so. We're going to get started. Good evening. To start us off this evening, I'm going to invite Kel Salem from the Squamish Nation to come up here.
Good evening, I think it is now. Evening, everybody. I'm going to share a few words in the Squamish language to welcome you all here to the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And then I will translate those words for you so that you can all understand what I'm saying. I promise it'll be nice things. But I also just want to welcome everybody here tonight for this, I think, wonderful event on a very important issue, a very important topic that I think is really a beautiful opportunity for us as our communities to kind of have a chance to reevaluate the way that our communities work and our democracy works, and perhaps make it better. So I'll say Tinoyap Anaquatal 8 seats, Tinoyap Siam Chinkon Mantomiap Quis Nahame 8 Tameo. Chitwa 8 not to Hankupa, not to Tameo, Homatsquiam Ochomelch 8 Schotmish Ochomelch 8 Salewit Ochomelch. Chitwa 8 not to Stalmoch Tameo. Heart cut. Wanaux to swamchit te not tan sequetal. Amen. Unslate quins hutch eoch to snowayeth te not to seo hutchit. Neth source to meoch to stalmoch. A heart quiz intramosen twite, a quakeways twite. Chawat twite, Demont Quetsi Queance Nachum. I just shared in my language, we don't have a way of saying welcome, we just have a way of welcoming. The way I often think about it is that sometimes you don't have words for specific things in English, or we don't have words in our language, but that doesn't mean that the concept or the action doesn't exist, and that there's just no need for words because you just do it. And so for our community, in the long ago, when people would travel to our communities, we would welcome people into our communities, and you didn't have a word for welcome, you would just welcome them in. And there were certain protocols and etiquettes and diplomatic relations to welcoming your guests. One of them was addressing them. And the way I started my speech is by saying, to you, all of my relations, which talks to the concept of how we are all related and connected. As well as acknowledging all the respected people. I know there's a lot of elected leaders in this room. Myself, I'm an elected council member with the Squamish Nation, as well as one of the two spokespersons appointed by the Squamish Nation Council. I was elected recently in December, serving a 4-year term with my nation. And I think that also what I shared is just that to acknowledge the ancestors of this territory is a way for us as Indigenous people to both feel honored and recognized and seen, especially given the history of how Indigenous peoples were the opposite. That there was a time when our existence was denied, our right to our land was denied, and by some is still denied, but that has changed. And that changes when people change, and that changes when people advocate for change, which leads to elected leaders changing, which leads to parties changing, which leads to governments changing. And I couldn't, when I think about these concepts of territorial welcoming, I think about that after the last election, we had the Premier of British Columbia acknowledge in the newspapers that the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people have title to Vancouver. Something that no premier, I think, to this date has done with any First Nation in Canada. And I think that these types of moments are historic, and they're important. And they happen because people care enough to make it happen. And I think that also speaks to what I think tonight is also going to be about. People caring enough to make things happen. I myself have an interesting history of how I engage with electoral politics. There was a time when I actively chose not to participate. The last provincial election was the first provincial election that I ever participated in and voted in. I did not participate in the last federal election or any other election before that, other than my own nation's elections. And I did so out of a conscious choice for what I would call a pro kind of sovereigntist standpoint as an Indigenous activist. I think what really shook me to my core and changed my outlook was the election of the U.S. president in the last American election. And I remember really having to grapple with that and grapple with the concept of what happens when people decide to let others make decisions for them. And I think that I still, to this day, will respect the rights of people who choose not to participate, choose not to vote. I think that is, in my opinion, it is a valid and understandable position for some people, and I respect it, and I don't chastise people for choosing not to vote. Because I just look at it as people choosing to let others decide for them who they want in government. But for me, I think that it really struck to my heart what happens when we stay home. And what happens, how these elections matter, and governments matter, and they make changes in the lives of people. And so as it relates to this issue of electoral reform, which I'm so eternally grateful is happening, and that we can have this conversation, I think is really striking to the heart of, I know in the concept we call it proportional representation, but what I think to be really true is actually it's the representation aspect that I think is actually the most important. That we feel represented in our communities and and theoretically in our government, and that everybody can feel represented. And I think the options that are presented in the referendum coming up this fall actually give a chance for us to have those conversations about how do we best want to be represented. And this concept that I've heard others talk about, which is that if you could design a democracy from scratch, would you design it with a first-past-the-post system where people with 40% of the vote get 100% of the power? Is that a way we would design a system if we were designing it from scratch? But also I think that's something that's also really important when we think about proportional representation for me as an Indigenous person. I think about things about the inclusion and the ability for all types of groups to be represented in government. I think specifically about the ways that women are more represented in democracies with proportional representation, and how minorities are more represented, and in this case, Indigenous people. And I think in the context of, you can't see it, but I actually have a moko that I got from Aotearoa 4 years ago, and I was actually in New Zealand just in December. And I have friends, actually. I have a few friends who are elected representatives in New Zealand, and were elected. Some were elected through the party lists, and some were elected through their local constituencies. People that I got to know from my travels and connections there. And I know people in government right now in New Zealand as a result of their system. And I talked to a lot of my Maori friends and connections there about when they had their referendum. And I remember I was asking them, what was it like for you? And they said, oh yeah, that was really simple. We just voted yes on it. It made total sense to vote yes on it. And they were very nonchalant about it. But what was interesting is a lot of my friends that voted on it, they were in their 20s, like I am, when the referendum happened and when they had a chance to vote on this. But I also think about some of the people I met in New Zealand who were elected because New Zealand specifically, a country in many ways very similar to Canada as it relates to Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, where there is historic treaties, where there is a historic relationship between Indigenous communities and the Crown, and where there is a particular attention paid to the role that Indigenous people have in our society, not because of our skin color, not because of our ethnicity, but because we are nations, and that there is an expectation that the Crown has made to have a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people, that we have a distinct place in this society, and that is at the founding makeup of our country. And I think that for too long that concept has been confused to think that it's based off of race or ethnicity. When we understand from the Constitution, as well as the treaties, as well as many other things, and in the context of BC, where there are no treaties, and the question remains opened, around what type of relationship does BC want to have with Indigenous peoples. And so I look forward to the work that's going to happen tonight's conversation. I also was really struck by, in the report from the Attorney General, about the particular attention that was paid to Indigenous representation within possible proportional representation, something to be studied after the referendum, and looking at models like what they use in New Zealand. So I think that there's lots to talk about, and this is an exciting opportunity for our province to really move forward in a way that I think is positive for all of our communities. And we can celebrate our successes as we move forward, just like we're celebrating now the opportunity to have this conversation. So I look forward to tonight's conversation. I'm really excited. I'm honored to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. And I just really want to say, Chinquan Mantomi Ap. I'm grateful to each and every one of you, and thank you for being here, and I welcome you to the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Osiam.
Thank you, Kelsey. My name is Maria Dobrinskaya. I'm the BC Director with the Broadbent Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with the Institute, we're one of Canada's leading progressive independent organizations championing change through the promotion of democracy, equality, sustainability, and the training of a new generation of leaders. We believe that combining our progressive principles and our collective efforts can inform new ways of thinking and new approaches to government that can better equip us to address the challenges we are facing. We want to bring attention to the need to evolve the social democratic values that guide us as a society, and a key aspect of that is addressing the erosion of trust in our democracy and our democratic institutions. One of the key focuses of the Institute is the area of democratic renewal. Those of you familiar with Ed Broadbent's work will know that he's been talking about proportional representation for decades, and I'm honored to be able to carry that conversation here in BC forward. The Broadbent Institute is pleased to be working with a number of like-minded organizations here in BC towards a more fair voting system that puts people first. And I'd like to now welcome Lindsay Popes, Executive Director of Lead Now, who's a partner with us both in our efforts around proportional representation, but also in hosting the event tonight. Thanks.
Good evening. I want to thank the Broadbent Institute for asking us to partner on this event, but mostly I really want to thank Maria Dobrinskaya for all the hard work she's done to put together this wonderful evening. I have been really looking forward to this conversation. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces in the crowd tonight, but I gotta be honest, I'm excited about the people I haven't yet met. That means for me that people are getting engaged in this issue, and it shows how broad-based this movement needs to be if we're gonna win this. Lead Now envisions a just, sustainable, and equitable Canada, built and defended through the democratic power of an engaged public. We campaign on some of the most important issues of our generation: climate change, inequality, human rights, and yes, democracy. And we do this work even though we know it's hard, because our broken electoral system distorts power, and like we just saw in Ontario, a party can get a false majority of power and form government without a majority of the popular vote. The foundation for all the campaigns we are fighting to win is a strong democracy, one that's fair, representative, and accountable. And we know this better democracy is possible, and we know we have a chance to bring it to BC, but it's not going to be easy. I'm excited, and I know you are too, to hear from Helen about New Zealand's experience in moving proportional representation to the forefront, and how the referendum campaign played out on the ground. Her experience in leading successive, stable coalition governments, and her reflections on how changing the voting system has impacted New Zealand over the past 2 decades. We like to talk a lot about the success of proportional representation in New Zealand, but I know for certain it was a hard-fought battle, and I'm especially excited to hear and learn from the campaign challenges so we can apply those lessons here in BC. Many people have said this is our best chance for proportional representation, and I have to disagree. This fall's referendum will give us what I call a fighting chance to vote for a better way of electing governments, and it's one we shouldn't take for granted. If we let this opportunity slip away, we'll wake up on December 1st with the same old voting system our great-grandparents used, one that distorts powers into the hands of a false majority government, one that requires people to vote strategically and leaves young people out, knowing often their vote won't count. We already see that a well-funded no side is organizing and throwing big money at this campaign. They are sowing the seeds of mistrust and doubt, and we need to counter this, and I believe the best way to do that is with people power. It's going to take a major organizing effort. I know for the people in this room, it might seem shocking, but a lot of people in British Columbia don't know a referendum is happening in the fall. We need people to vote, and we need to not throw their ballot out with their junk mail. The difference between someone casting their ballot or not could be a single conversation with a volunteer, and this fall, Lead Now plans to have thousands. We need to be having those face-to-face conversations, talking to people on phones, and telling people about the referendum, and making sure they get out to vote. I hope you'll be inspired by tonight. I hope you get your questions answered, and you're motivated to get involved. There are many Lead Now volunteers in the room. They're wearing our jewel-toned purple t-shirts, looking fabulous. They're waiting to take your information and loop you into the campaign. I hope you'll enjoy this evening, and I hope you'll join this movement. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm now going to welcome our guests up to the stage. I'm just going to introduce, first I'll introduce Gary Mason. Probably doesn't need much of an introduction to many of you, but Gary began his journalism career in BC in 1981, working as a summer intern for Canadian Press. One of his first assignments was covering the last days of the province's favorite son, Terry Fox. Gary would later go on to work for the Victoria Times Colonist before joining the Vancouver Sun, where he worked for 19 years in a variety of roles, including legislative bureau chief, city editor, and deputy managing editor, before he began writing a popular sports column in 1997. He joined the Globe and Mail in 2005 as a national affairs columnist based in Vancouver. Gary is a 5-time National Newspaper Award nominee, winning it 3 times. He's received BC's highest journalism honor, the Jack Webster Award, 8 times. Recently, he was recognized with the Bruce Hutchinson Lifetime Achievement Award. He's authored or co-authored 6 books. He appears frequently on television and radio to speak about everything from politics to sports. And we're very honored that Gary's agreed to join us this evening. You guys probably want to hear about the other person who's going to hear. Helen Clark was elected Prime Minister of New Zealand, first in 1999 and then twice more in 2002 and 2005, making her the first Prime Minister to secure 3 consecutive terms in office. First elected to Parliament in 1981, in 1987, Clark became a member of the Cabinet, holding at various times the portfolios of housing, conservation, labour, and health. In 1989 and 90, she served as Deputy Prime Minister, and in 1990 was appointed to the Privy Council, becoming the first woman in New Zealand to hold those offices. After the National Party returned to power in 1990, Helen Clark served as Deputy Leader of the Opposition from 1990 to 1993, and then as Leader of the Opposition until the Labour Party was able to form a governing coalition following the 1999 election. Elected Prime Minister, Clark also held the portfolio of arts and culture and appointed an extraordinarily diverse cabinet, including 11 women and 4 Maori. The Clark government prioritized reconciliation and the settlement of historic grievances with New Zealand's Indigenous peoples and the development of an inclusive, multicultural, and multi-faith society, and addressed many controversial issues, including Maori rights, same-sex civil unions, and prostitution, which was legalized in 2003. Her government also opposed the U.S. and British invasion of Iraq. Re-elected Prime Minister in both 2002 and 2005, Helen Clark became the first New Zealand Prime Minister to secure 3 consecutive terms in office. Who says proportional representation isn't stable, eh? After public politics, Helen Clark became the administrator of the United Nations Development Program in April 2009 and was the first woman to lead the organization. She was also the chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programs, and departments working on development issues. Helen Clark stepped down after 8 years as an administrator in April 2017. Throughout her career, Clark has enjoyed a reputation as a skillful politician and a capable advocate of nuclear disarmament and public health policy. For her work on peace and disarmament, she was awarded the Peace Prize from the Danish Peace Foundation in 1986. In 2009, she was made a member of the Order of New Zealand, the country's highest honor. And we are very appreciative and honored to have Helen Clark join us today. Helen and Gary.
Test, test.
It's going.
Can you hear me? Well, welcome. I know you've been here a few days. I'm glad to see you survived the wilds of Alberta, that you weren't eaten by a bear.
It's a risk.
It is a risk. And I know you've been here long enough to get into a Twitter war already about proportional representation. I'm glad to see you're as feisty as ever. I thought tonight it might be useful to take people here through sort of the arc of change in New Zealand, sort of from the beginning of this idea through the referendum process, through the transition, the rocky transition, to your years as the Prime Minister for 9 years and the realities of governing under this type of system. And I thought throughout this, while we're talking, we could sort of maybe focus in on some issues that you had to deal with that are already starting to surface here in British Columbia in terms of this referendum. So let me start by saying that I was sort of surprised when I was doing a little bit of research about New Zealand politics to learn that early in the 1900s, New Zealand had a different voting system than first past the post. It was something called the second ballot system, where each person who was elected had to have 50% of the vote. And if they didn't get 50%, there was a runoff with the second, with the top two people. But that only lasted 5 years, and then you went to first past the post. Now, the reason I mention this is that it sort of indicated to me that there was something in the DNA of New Zealanders that sort of were, sort of looked out for fairness, that accountability was important to them, even though they did go to first past the post, that there was something there. But anyway, regardless, you went with first past the post, and it stayed in place for decades until about the 70s and 80s. And then a new discussion took place around electoral reform, and in part it was led by your party that campaigned in, I guess, 1984, I believe, on the idea of having a royal commission into electoral reform. Before we get to the result of that royal commission, though, I wanted to ask you, what was the catalyst for that new discussion on electoral reform? Was it something in specific that New Zealanders were angry about? Was it a particular election? What caused this sort of rebirth around this discussion?
Well, if you go back to the dynamic that led to the idea of having the Royal Commission, it would have come for Labour out of two things. In the 1978 and 1981 general elections, Labour won more votes but got fewer seats and could not form a government. And that, of course, leads to quite a grievance. Hillary Clinton could make the same point today, right? Is the system fair if you get more votes but fewer seats? Now, secondly, there'd long been a push from what used to be the major third party in New Zealand, and that was social credit, which in a good year could poll us up to 20% or so, but never got more than 2 members of parliament. And people knew that really wasn't very fair either. So it was really those two things that were in the background to the debate that led to the idea of having a Royal Commission to thrash out the issues.
Okay. So a Royal Commission is struck and reports out in 1986 and recommends MMP, mixed member proportional. I'm going to go with MMP because I can't say that constantly all night. But so it recommends MMP in 1986, but for about the next 5 years, really nothing is done on this. And it, as I read it, the two main parties kind of dragged their feet in acting on this. And there were some pretty important voices in opposition to electoral reform, including yours truly. And so I thought that kind of surprised me, and I'm just wondering what you could talk about why you opposed it initially.
Well, I suppose it was partly a fear of the unknown, because you don't know what will happen to your own political party and the system with change. And that's why I think the New Zealand experience is really quite interesting for British Columbia, because it's hard to think of any other jurisdiction in the Anglo-American democracies that has made a change like this in modern times. So that was a concern. As well, I think in New Zealand, the models of stable government under proportional representation were not so well known. You know, people are more inclined to know about what happens in Canada and the United States and Australia and the United Kingdom than they are to know what happens in Germany or in the Scandinavian democracies or the Netherlands or whatever. So it is quite a fundamental change to make a change to the electoral system. It's not just about the way in which you vote. It actually does change the culture, and so it was a step into the unknown. But if we look at then what changed and made this a really compelling force for change in New Zealand, you have to understand the modern political history, which was that we had majority first past the post-elected governments, which were seen to act like elective dictatorships in office. And we had a very authoritarian conservative leader called Muldoon, who in the end people couldn't wait to get rid of, but then it was replaced by a Labour government that did a lot of things that people didn't expect. And people started to say, what have we got here? We've got an electoral system that keeps electing these governments that do things that really we don't agree with. And there was a bit of a revulsion, you could say, against the political class that drove in the end, the quite substantial vote in the first referendum to have a change.
In 1992, there's a non-binding referendum that asks the electorate two questions. One, do you favor their status quo, or do you want to change to a form of proportional representation? If so, the second question, which of these four systems would you prefer? We're sort of at that stage here in British Columbia, and the template that we're using is very much similar to that one. So this is of interest to us. How much time did the population have to consider these four systems that were on offer, and what kind of education campaign accompanied it to explain to people what these systems meant?
Well, I think the process that was adopted was seen to be quite fair. And bear in mind that the National Party, which is the major conservative party in New Zealand, its leader did promise a referendum. So he had to go ahead with it, even though he got a very strong election result in 1990, a very big majority. He had to go ahead. And so they were, as I recall, reasonably consultative about the way in which this would happen. And there was quite a lead-up to the 1992 indicative referendum, which had two questions, as you say. The first one, do you want change to the electoral system or not? 85% voted to change it. 85%. And that really tells you quite a lot about the level of revulsion against the political class. Because by the time that the referendum was held, this new Conservative government had also broken a lot of promises. And there was, I don't want to go into a great digression on this, but one of the hot issues in the 1990 election was the New Zealand superannuation scheme. And the incoming Prime Minister had said, no ifs, no buts, no maybes, we will not change it. And he did. So that just about sealed the fate of the voting system, I think, of people just feeling you never get what you think you voted for. So 85%. And then the second question, as you say, was, well, regardless of whether or not you voted for change, if there is to be change, which of the four options would you like? Now, in that, MMP got 70% because it was the most known of the options, because the electoral reform lobby that had really been in full cry for some years before had always focused on MMP, the German system, as the one that they thought would work best for New Zealand. The other three, there was a supplementary member, which was a form of proportional representation where the proportionality only applied to the list vote, right? You have two votes, candidate vote, party list vote. With MMP, the party list vote determines the overall proportionality in the parliament. With this SMP, the list vote only determined the list members' proportionality. technical point, but it's actually quite important. Another option was single transferable vote, which is used for the Australian Senate and also for Irish elections. That doesn't go down so well in the New Zealand political culture and probably wouldn't here, because you lose your single member constituency or riding member. You go to multi-member electorates. And then the fourth option was the preferential voting that prevails in the Australian lower house, and which is the same as what you described from 1908 to 13, the second ballot system. And I think that was what was in effect put to the British referendum when the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with David Cameron and the Conservatives in recent years. So anyway, clearly MMP and clearly a vote for change. So then the next year was spent on Parliament actually having a dedicated select committee, doing the research, doing the offshore visits, looking at political systems, and legislating for the form of MMP which would come into effect if the referendum for it carried. So people did know what they were voting for. The Electoral Commission, of course, was bound to ensure that both sides of the case were put, and I understand that's going to be the case here in British Columbia as well. When it went to the binding referendum on the straight question...
Wait.
Yep.
I got to stop you there for a sec, because I have a question about, because it's relevant to the situation here. The four potential systems that were put on the ballot, they were all systems that were in place somewhere in the world. Is that fair to say, or had been used someplace?
Well, three of them were. Definitely MMP, definitely preferential voting, and definitely STV, or single transferable vote. I'm not sure about supplementary member system. It may have been tried. I mean, some countries actually changed their electoral system quite a lot, and the Italians changed it in and out and may have got pretty close to a form of that at some point.
The reason I ask is... on the ballot here in British Columbia, there are two options that have not been used before anywhere in the world. This has become a focus for the no side. Like, why would we be guinea pigs to systems that haven't been used, even if they have been kind of designed with British Columbia in mind? I mean, speaking as a politician, I mean, can you understand that concern? I mean, the public doesn't like to be seen as a guinea pig. Do you think that this is going to be a problem for those two systems? Will people vote against them naturally because they don't know whether they will work or not?
Well, it might actually throw votes towards MMP as the option, right? Whether it would influence the vote for or against change, I think, is another matter. But as I see it, the putting the other two options in is well intentioned, in that it's looking at, well, if we were to design something that was very specific British Columbian, would it look, something like these two options? But you're right. I mean, obviously they haven't been tried anywhere else because they're proportional representation with distinctive BC characteristics, so they're not known anywhere else.
Right. Okay, so let's move to the 1992, the 93. Which was held in conjunction with the general election, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Correct.
Now, that was a referendum, by all accounts, that was a knockdown, drag-out affair that was really rough and tumble. I mean, both sides were going at it in a big way. What do you recall about that referendum?
Well, in a funny way, I recall less about it than I do about the one the year before, because that was a standalone exercise. Whereas this referendum went in with a general election campaign. And of course, in the general election, you'll normally get a bigger turnout, which is often a reason for running things at general elections. But so was it the dominant issue in the 1993 election campaign? In a funny way, probably not. I think the more dominant issue was probably the broken promises. But that would then have played into also a vote for change, with people saying, we really can't carry on with the system that we've got that enables a single party majority government to do what it likes when it's in office.
Now, in that 93 election and that referendum, there were politicians in both major parties that spoke out against reform. Did you take a public position, either way on the referendum in that?
Yeah, my position would have been to vote against reform at that point, because that was consistent with the position adopted earlier. But, you know, that wasn't the view that prevailed. I mean, 54% in the straight runoff voted for MMP over first past the post. People really did want change. So in a sense, you're on a hiding to nothing, and you'll probably anticipate this with the next questions on the transition. Then you have to say, well, the people have spoken, right? The people have spoken. So you've got to make it work, and that I think everybody really knuckled down to. How were you going to make it work?
The no side. I mean, the support for electoral reform did decrease in that referendum. And it was like, as you say, it was in the initial question in the non-binding referendum, it was 86%, and it fell to something like 56%, or just under 56%.
54, I think.
54.
Yeah.
So that would indicate to me that the no forces did make some inroads, that they did have an effect. What would you say, looking back, what was the most compelling argument that the no side used against change?
I think just simply against change, just simply status quo, because while the MMP proposal was fully fleshed out in an Act of Parliament, still, to most voters who aren't consumed by these questions every day of the week like politicians and journalists are, to most it would probably still have been a bit academic. You don't really know what you're getting. That would have been probably the underlying sentiment that a no campaign would have worked on.
So, in a way, the scare tactics worked a little bit for the no side. I mean, I think in '92 it was a non-binding referendum. Now it's like, okay, this is it. This is the real thing. Yeah. So I think some people probably got scared off. What would you say the most compelling argument on the other side for change? What was their biggest weapon that they used to convince voters to continue through and push this thing over the finish line?
I think just to keep taking the high ground of saying, look, we haven't been happy with what we've had. It's delivered results where the party with the most votes got fewer seats. It's excluded a range of political opinion, from Greens to social credit in the old days to whatever. And, fundamentally that's not fair, and they would have pointed to, the stability of the German system. Probably the Scandinavians were brought in at this point, and people would have said, give it a go. And also what was important, and this I think is important in the British Columbia proposal, you are proposing, because you've only really got one round of referenda to introduce the system. We had two. But you are proposing that it will be voted on again in 2 elections' time. Now, we didn't have that proposal, but what we did have was that there would be a review. So people thought, oh, well, if you don't like it, there'll be a chance to look at it again. And, of course, review is a lot less specific than actually promising another referendum. And I think that's quite a strong card for the pro-reform campaign here, to say, well, give it a go. Look at the sort of results that we've been getting with first past the post in Canada. You've just had in British Columbia your election last year where the Greens got 17% of the vote, which is quite a lot. Certainly didn't get 17% of the seats, they got 3. I also look at some of the quite extreme results which first past the post has delivered in your country. If we go back to the end of the Mulroney, Kim Campbell governments, they went from a majority in Parliament to 2 seats. Now, okay, people were probably sick of them, but they didn't get 2% of the vote, right? They probably got in the 30-somethings. And the same thing happened, I understand, in BC in the early 2000s, where a majority government was reduced to 2 seats. Now, in my opinion, this is very bad for the functioning of the political system, because every government needs a strong opposition. And if the opposition is 2 seats, well, with the best will in the world, the most brilliant people, there's not a lot they can do to hold the government to account. So I think for you, sort of, in this campaign, looking at it from the point of view, look, we've had really some quite bizarre outcomes from this. We look at the New Zealand model, we can see that they've delivered a couple of decades of stable government with it. We should give it a go. We've been absolutely promised another referendum on the 2 elections' time, so if we don't like it, if we're not happy, then we get a go to revisit it. But, if we don't do it now, if not now, when? If this last election with the 17% producing 3 seats doesn't tell us there's something rather unfair here, then what is going to convince us of that?
I thought it might be useful to talk about some of the criticisms, the general criticisms of PR, and then maybe talk about some of the issues that have arisen here in British Columbia. You're as a politician and somebody who's worked in the system. But one of the most common complaints that you hear about PR, various forms of it, including MMP, is that it increases the number of representatives in Parliament. You have to add politicians, you have to add people to the pension plan, that it costs more. So naturally, people who are opposed to bigger government don't like this right off the hop. I mean, that must have come up. I think I remember a poster from the 1993 election that said, I'd rather have 120 MPs in a democracy than 99 MPs in a dictatorship. So obviously it was an issue in that referendum. But did it resonate with people? Is it a problem?
I'm not sure it was a major problem, because when the legislation that was going to be triggered by a yes vote was being designed, one of the issues was how many MPs should there be? And you could have just stayed with what we had, which was probably around 97. We used to have a sort of complicated system of the number of seats, which was determined by a minimum number for the South Island, and that meant we kept getting more electorates. So it was probably about 97. And when the research was done to inform the Act, the general view that came out of that was actually, for a national parliament like New Zealand's, you needed 120 members of parliament to have a strong enough core of members of parliament who were not in the executive, right? Because if a too big a proportion of the governing party are in the executive, then you have less chance of holding executives to account. So I don't think for most people really the 120 was a big issue. What the 120 also had going for it was that, given you were designing it to be half elected from what you call ridings, we call constituencies, and half from the list, then you were only going down from 97 to 60 of those MPs. Whereas if you tried to do off the 97, you would have been going down to, from the 97 to half of that. So the electorates would have been even bigger than they had to be under MMP. And then that would have given rise to more complaints from rural voters that their constituencies were too big. So yeah, that was the sort of argument that went into it.
Yeah, and that you mentioned the rural voter. I mean, that's another. I won't say it's a myth. It's another concern that people have, that under PR, various forms of PR, that rural voters will be less represented than the urban voters. Would that become an issue in New Zealand?
Not really, because what we've also seen with MMP is that areas that have been so safe for Labour in the past in the cities that the national voters' votes didn't count, suddenly in these areas you saw with MMP national list MPs' offices springing up, and they were able to give voice to the people who supported them in those areas. And similarly, in the rural areas where Labour didn't poll so well, it was able to place, list MPs' offices and say, here's a Labour voice from your province. So in many ways, I think, people ended up better represented, rural and urban.
I don't mean to focus on the negatives, but I think it's important to have you address some of the sort of the talking points of the no side. Another one is the lists that you mentioned. There's a concern that these lists are filled with party hacks and that these are basically amount to patronage appointments. How did you combat that? I mean, I know that was a concern in New Zealand during the referendum, that became an issue. What do you say to people that these lists, people don't know the people on these lists, and who are they, and are they patronage appointments?
Well, with the lists, firstly, both the major parties would encourage their MPs to be available for the list. So actually people do know a lot of names on the list, because there are also people who are running in constituencies and have been MPs for a long time. Some MPs don't want to go on the list, but most people do. They play the game. But secondly, with the list, generally parties have made quite a big effort to make their lists look like New Zealand, look like the population. And that's where the argument comes in that you can get much more diversity in representation. With MMP, for example, Indigenous people's representation in Parliament is vastly increased, underline vastly increased. Pacific people, very important ethnic minority in New Zealand, around 7-8% of the population, always now a significant core of Pacific MPs. The first Asian MPs, East Asian and South Asian, began to be elected from lists as well. And for women, it had quite a dramatic effect, because in one MMP election, we went from 20% female to 30% female. It sort of hovered around there for a while. We're now up to 37.8, which is close, to 40, and you can start to see that parity is possible. But this would not have happened in this kind of time frame under first past the post, which is the most difficult system for someone, and I don't really like using the term, but for someone who is not a white male with a wife and family to break into, right? Because that has been traditionally the stereotype of MPs in our democracies. And it excluded a lot of people. I should also say that with MMP, we have seen more LGBTI members of Parliament as well, and winning constituencies. In fact, the first transgender MP in the world was elected for my party in a kind of rural constituency outside Wellington.
This is a question I should have asked you earlier when we were talking about the 4 options that were on the ballot, the 92 ballot. I only ask this very quickly because this is, again, something that's become an issue here, and that concerns boundary changes, that most often when you move to a new system, it does affect the boundaries. Yeah. The government is not going to have the time to tell people how their electoral boundary might change under the system that they're voting for. Did you guys have maps, and did everybody know how their boundaries were going to be affected?
We didn't have maps before that second referendum, but we do have a Boundaries Commission which has been more or less seen to be fair, right? It's always chaired by a judge. It has on it the Chief Electoral Commissioner, the chair of the Local Government Commission. It has traditionally had representatives from government and opposition. So everybody gets a go. So that wasn't really a consideration. I think people assumed that, if we went for MMP, yes, the constituencies would be bigger, but the process of determining them would be a fair one.
Okay. As you probably know, British Columbia has already had 2 whacks at this before, in 2005, 2009. The initial referendum was basically overseen by a citizens' assembly. It was kind of a neutral body that researched it, came up with an option called STV that you've referenced already, and put this on a ballot. It just fell so short of the threshold, the 60% threshold. It was put on the ballot again in 2009, and the support for it was even less in 2009. This time around, the NDP government, which is advocating for change, has taken a more active role in the process. The Attorney General has sort of overseen the process. There was a consultation process where people had a chance to write in and tell how they felt, and then his office came up with the ballot and the 4 types or the 3 types of issues that are the systems that are going to be on the ballot. Long-winded way of saying that this has allowed a narrative to set in that the government has rigged the system in favor of reform, that they have gerrymandered this whole thing. I think, to some extent, that narrative has sunk in a little bit, as unfair as it may be, or fair, however you view it. But do you see that as a potential problem for a government if they are seen to be taking and pushing a referendum in a certain direction?
Well, I think what's a bit unusual here compared with the New Zealand experience was in New Zealand, the major political parties did not take party positions, because there are people on both sides of the line in both parties. And so it was one of those campaigns, a bit like Brexit, if you like, where you had pros and antis from both parties, joining together in the different camps. But look, I think the fact that the upfront question is, do you want change, yes or no? If they don't want it, well, don't vote for it. But you can hardly blame a government for saying, do you want it, yes or no? I mean, that seems to me to be a pretty fair question. And those who vote yes, so then, they're going to have, a clearer view probably about what they'd want on the second question. But I just think you're probably in for about 4 months of a lot of heated discussion, some of which will have some merit and some of which won't have much at all. But that's part of the democratic process, isn't it? And in the end, it's over to the voters. If they want it, they'll get it. If they don't want it, they won't.
How much time do you think voters need to really consider this? I mean, when it comes to general elections, people often don't make a decision, don't make up their mind till the last minute. I mean, do you think people actually need months and months to study this? Or the truth is, it's probably going to be one day that they look down and take a look at this stuff and decide what they want to do.
It may well be. And it's not as if the subject is new, right? You pointed out that in the last, 13 years or so, you've voted on it twice. So people know, they know this issue's been around a long time, and here it is, it's come back again. There is, in modern elections and Western democracies, an increasing number of people who decide what they're going to vote on the day. So that may well be the case here, and probably what that says to those who are advocating reform is you've got to keep going right up to the day, right? Because some people, maybe most people, are only going to focus on this in the last week. And they may go into the last week not knowing what they'll do.
Yeah.
And they can swing it.
I've talked to, I'm obviously, I support electoral reform. I hope it goes through. I've had some issues with some of the ways that the referendum process has been worked out, but nonetheless, the problem, I think, with a lot of people, I have very smart friends, and when I start talking to them about the various systems, their eyes glaze over. They just can't get their head around it. I start talking and explaining, and they just don't have any idea what I'm talking about. I think it's one of the reasons why MMP went through, because I think it's the easiest system to explain to people.
Yeah. Because you've got real live examples.
Yeah.
In the end, there was the German example that, carried the day in New Zealand, and now you've got the German and the New Zealand examples. So that's pretty clear. It works in those countries, right? Yeah. It actually works quite well.
Yeah. So let's move now to governing under this new system. It was brought in 1996. You were the opposition leader at the time, so you didn't get stuck with having to deal with all the everything that comes with having to bring in a new, but you had a front row seat to that transition. Tell us a bit about what that was like for New Zealand.
Well, we had an election where the vote for the two major parties declined quite a lot. I think the National Party got about 35% and Labour got 28%. So really a bit pathetic on both sides. And other parties rose quite a lot. The New Zealand First Party, it was right up there somewhere. And the alliance grouping of parties was coming in with a reasonable amount of support. I think if you added Labour, New Zealand First and Alliance, you got a majority. But if you added National and New Zealand First, you got a majority. So it must have been about 35 and 15 or 16 or something like that. So what happened after the election, and an interesting point, in New Zealand the Governor-General stands right back. The Governor-General says it's up to the political parties to talk, and then the person who believes they can command a majority in Parliament should come to me, and make that case. And so for 9 weeks after the 1996 election, both Labour and National negotiated with New Zealand First. And one interesting point is that New Zealand First wanted a rather detailed coalition agreement, so the 9 weeks was spent going through every area of policy and kind of writing a manifesto for the government. That proved not to be the best way to do things, I can say, having watched it unfold over the next 3 years, because inevitably when you do that, neither side is really particularly happy with the outcome, and they start to strain away from it. And when we went into government in '99, informed by that experience, which had seen, by the way, Winston Peters and New Zealand First thrown out of the government. So the first 3 years was a little bit odd. And let me say in brackets, you are in effect now seeing a government operating as it would under MMP, and actually operating quite well, you know. So you don't have to repeat, and you're not repeating the mistakes of what happened in 96 to 99 in New Zealand. What we did in 99 was go into coalition, and I always had minority coalition governments, by the way. I never had a majority coalition. Minority coalition governments and confidence and supply arrangements. We had really the one-pager coalition agreement, which said we would work together in good faith with each other to advance the general objectives of a progressive New Zealand, whatever. Very simple. And then we got on with it, got on with the priorities that we had. It works because you have a lot of consultation mechanisms, but it also works, and I think it worked better from 1999 on, because, and then my 9 years and then the next 9 years of the Conservative government, and now, because we established new constitutional conventions. New Zealand does not have a written constitution, right? It has a cabinet manual, which is quite important. The cabinet manual used to set out that a minister who couldn't accept a decision of the cabinet had to resign. You know, and governments could fall over these kinds of things. Well, there's no point in that when you have, you know, two parties in a government. You have to redesign things, and we redesigned it so that a minority party in the government could differentiate itself on issues that it didn't agree with the majority on. And if the majority thought it could get a majority in the parliament from somewhere else, it was free to go and try to do that, but the minority could differentiate. And the fact that its ministers voted against something in the parliament didn't bring down the government. So you have to change that kind of thing. We also, as the years went on, brought in another innovation. And the media did sort of huff and puff and chest beat about this for a little while, till they got used to it, as they do. But we went to confidence and supply agreements where the support parties did not want to be in coalition, but their leaders wanted portfolios. So, Mr. Peters, for example, became my foreign minister. He wasn't in a coalition. He was the head of a support party. And this is the case right now in New Zealand, where Labour is in coalition with New Zealand First. The Greens have a confidence and supply agreement, but they have ministers. Now, in these situations, the ministers from the support parties are collectively responsible for decisions in their portfolios, which must go through all the normal cabinet processes, but they're not collectively responsible for any other decisions of the government. And so the government, to advance something in Parliament, it works bill by bill, issue by issue. Now, you know, some people say, oh, isn't this time-consuming? Doesn't it slow things up? All I can say is look at the record of my government, which was a major reforming government, and you know, if you get the system right, if you get the relationships right, if you get used to working in a collaborative fashion rather than just deciding in your own party room, you will see these systems function quite well and not be bureaucratic and cumbersome.
So when... Just as a sort of a practical, way of governing. I mean, if you were preparing a major bill, would you bring your governing partner in at some stage to tell them what you're up to, what to expect? I think you and I talked earlier, you said sort of one of your sort of overarching mottos was no surprises. You couldn't surprise your governing partner. So what did you do to, when you say collaboration, how did you bring them into that process?
Well, what was done sort of came from the head of my private office, who was obviously, political appointee. And she had her counterparts, chiefs of staff for each of the support parties who were her network. And so she would meet very regularly with them. So they always knew what was on the government agenda to be discussed. And then with each of the ministers, they had to know their counterpart in the support parties. And their chief of staff had to know the support parties' researchers who are working on these issues. And bear in mind, usually the support parties are a lot smaller than the major government party, so people do need a bit of time. They haven't got big research units, so it does take time. They may ask for briefings from government officials, and the government officials are happy to do that, providing it's got the minister's permission, and often the minister would be in on those meetings. But the key thing was, you would never go to a support party and say, tomorrow we're going to introduce this bill and we expect you to vote for it, because you'd probably be told to leave, right? You don't do that. What you do is right at the very beginning, people have to know, we're thinking of working up something on that, would you like to have more discussion about it, input, etc. The same with the budget. With the budget, we would go to support parties and ask them for their bids, just like we asked ministers for their bids, right? The Greens always had bids. New Zealand First had bids. That's how you did it. You had to be very inclusive. And you can see, I hope from what I'm saying, that the political culture rather changes with this sort of government. Because it's not the government saying, we know best and this is the way it's going to do and we've got a majority, go suck your finger at a corner. No. You have to actually behave in a very collaborative way. How refreshing, yes.
Can you think of a time during the 9 years that you were Prime Minister where you had to compromise or even had to abandon a major piece of legislation or a policy that was dear to your heart that you had to abandon or compromise radically because of the minority situation that you're in, because your partner didn't want to support it? Can you think of anything like that?
Well, we never took things to Parliament to lose, right? We didn't lose votes in Parliament because we didn't advance things that didn't have a majority. But there was an issue, for example, on free trade agreements. So the free trade agreement with Singapore, where the party that was in coalition with us, to the left of us, at that time, it didn't, as a matter of principle, support free trade agreements. On the other hand, it knew that Labor was going to advance it. So that's where the differentiation process worked. They indicated from the outset. They then absented themselves from Cabinet Committee and such discussions on the matter, and Labor reached across the floor to the Conservatives to work that through and get a majority. So you could do that kind of thing. In particularly, I think the last couple of... I had 3 terms in government. The first term, in a sense, was the most straightforward because you had a majority for Labor, the party to the left of Labor, and the Greens. But after that, there wasn't a majority, if you like, for progressive parties. You had to reach into the centre more. And one of them had a bottom line policy that he didn't want anything on cannabis reform. He's now changed his mind, by the way, but anyway. But that really was a bit annoying because New Zealand has dropped a bit behind other countries, including your own, on these sorts of issues. And in this current term of government, no, there's not a majority among the coalition and support parties for it, but it is going to go to a referendum. So that's another way of dealing with it. But at the time, he wouldn't even consent to, referenda. So that was irritating. But, you can see I'm not really talking about issues that are kind of the mega issues. They're more kind of niche issues that someone had a bee in their bonnet about, literally.
Just listening to you talk, it makes me think that a leader under proportional representation or any form of proportional representation has to have a different skill set than a leader under first past the post, where it's you are saying, essentially anything I say goes. This way, it's not everything I say goes. We have to. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And we had a history of rather strong-minded autocratic male prime ministers, and that just wouldn't work today. Couldn't work at all. You have to be able to sort of go with the punches, go with the flow, and work things through. And you do the best you can, but you can't dictate the outcomes because you don't have a majority for your party in the parliament. So you've just got to find other ways of working towards the direction that you want. And we used to operate on the philosophy that one bad day in government was certainly better than a year in opposition.
I think I better ask Maria now. I don't want to hog all the questions. There's probably some questions on the floor. So how do you want to? Should we just?
Take your mic.
Okay.
And we will take a few questions, and we're going to see if there's questions online as well. But first, we'll take one from the audience.
I just have a question going back to the pre-referendum time, and wondered if you can comment on what role civil society played in your process. You can see we're all involved here in non-governmental organization, and did they have a major role in the work prior to the referendum? And then also the media, and did they tend to support the media on one side, civil society on the other? Thank you.
Well, civil society led it, we have to say. There was a very well-organised electoral reform society, and they led the debate. In a sense, because the major parties were divided, it wasn't a party political issue. So it was a civil society-led issue. That was very important. Now, the media, that's interesting. The most influential paper in New Zealand is the New Zealand Herald. And it's usually been quite a conservative paper. It's the major, it's now the only Auckland paper. But actually the New Zealand Herald came out for MMP. It came out for it. So, the media didn't treat it as any kind of left-right issue. They looked at it on its merits. In New Zealand, you have, obviously Television New Zealand, which is like your CBC, which is required to have balance. But the Broadcasting Act also requires the private TV channels to have balance. It requires radio to have balance. So it's probably in the print media that you get strong opinions one way or the other. And as I say, the fact that the major newspaper came out for it was undoubtedly influential. These days with social media, it wouldn't matter so much, right? Because the print media are a bit on a downward trend, but it did matter then.
Thanks. Thank you. Like Gary, I'm looking for help with some of the common no arguments. And one of the ones that comes up a fair bit is that PR will enable the far right. And then they occasionally, the example pointed to right now is New Zealand First. And the fact that governments in New Zealand have had to rely upon New Zealand First. I'm hoping you could comment on that.
Well, first past the post kind of elected Trump, didn't it? Yeah. But I did respond to a tweet, because I now find I'm being trolled by the anti-campaigners in BC. I did respond to a tweet today that described Winston Peters as alt-right, which is really quite ridiculous. I mean, alt-right to me is Steve Bannon. Right? Well, I can assure you Winston Peters isn't that. Winston Peters is a sort of eclectic New Zealand phenomenon. And he made his name really as the advocate for the pensioners. He used to have a huge following among younger people because he fell out with his own party over their broken promise on New Zealand superannuation in the 1991 budget. And then he had quite a bit to say about immigration in the early 1990s as New Zealand adjusted to the consequences of a points system which had no racial discrimination in it. And so the number of migrants from East and South Asia started to rise. And that, that got a bit of voter traction. But New Zealand's an interesting place because I guess like Canada, it's had waves of migration. And while people may complain a little for a while, eventually, they're rubbing shoulders at the school and the corner store and the community meeting, and their kids start marrying each other, and they kind of forget it was ever an issue. And it really hasn't had much traction since those times. So he has tended to focus more, and this shows why the alt-right argument is so ridiculous about him. He's tended to focus more on the excesses of neoliberalism and how it's destroyed, parts of New Zealand's social policy and so on. He was my foreign minister for the last 3 years I was prime minister, and actually as foreign minister he did not put a foot wrong. 8 of the 9 years I was prime minister, I dealt with the George W. Bush administration, which was interesting. And Winston became Condoleezza Rice's best friend, which was quite helpful to New Zealand. So, look, I can't fault the job that he did for me. And I think, as foreign minister now in Jacinda Ardern's government, he'll, be pretty much the same. So, really to invoke him and New Zealand First isn't an argument against PR. Now, you could say the German election produced 92 neo-Nazi MPs. Yes, it did. But what are we saying? Are we saying that they shouldn't be in the parliament? I mean, I prefer them not to be, and I'd never vote for them, but clearly it represents a body of opinion. What we have seen in the European political systems, where these kinds of voices are coming through quite strongly, is that in general, and let's accept Austria from this, in general, the other political parties gang up against it. And so in Germany, you have another, Christian Democrat, Social Union, Social Democrat coalition. In France, when, the various members of the Le Pen party who get into the second round of every election, the left ended up voting for Chirac to make sure her father didn't win. The right voted for Hollande to make sure that she didn't win. And left and right, whose candidates did very badly, voted for Macron to make sure she didn't win. So that's the sort of thing that's been happening in Europe. So I think, in the end, these voices, they have to be able to be expressed. And you have to really appeal to the greater common sense of the electorate to see that they don't become a majority. But, sometimes, as to the south of here, large numbers of the electorate don't always think the way we do on these things.
Would you please speak to the percentage of the electorate who actually voted, both in the first 86%, when it dropped to 50%, 50+%, and after the new way of voting was implemented? Because percentages don't mean anything to me unless it's in context of the amount who voted.
Well, New Zealand has quite high voting turnout, right? So I can tell you in the last general election, it was just under 80% who voted. And if we go back to sort of simpler times, go back 30 years, it was over 90%. We now have a significant number of new migrants of voting age. So the voting is down a little bit because, if you have people who are coming from countries that aren't used to democratic political systems, they don't necessarily migrate into political participation, even at the level of voting, very quickly. Over time, I think they will. But we do expect to have turnouts of close to 80%. Now, in the 1992, the first round of the referendums wasn't at a general election. I would think that the turnout for that was probably lower than in 1993, when there was the determinative referendum that got the 54%. And I say that only because it was at a general election, and turnout is always higher at a general election than for something that's sort of done midterm.
Hi. Question I had, and I was curious was going to come up, but I'm wondering if you might want to talk about it, is what was your experience in your government because of the changes? Well, maybe talk a little bit about the Maori electorates that you have in New Zealand and the history of that, but also the changes that happened with your government and how it worked with Maori representation, Maori inclusion, and the changes that specifically proportional representation brought for Maori issues into the public sphere.
Well, what's interesting about New Zealand is that since the mid-19th century and people voting for members of parliament, there were Maori members of parliament. And actually it didn't come from a history of people saying Maori must be represented. It was more that a North Island, South Island thing, where the North Island thought the South Island was going to get too much influence with the influx of people to the goldfields. So it said, if there are Maori electorates, there's far more Maori in the North Island than the South Island, so that'll counterbalance the goldfields effect. And that's what established the Maori seats. And there were 3 from the North Island, 1 from the South Island. And that's the way it stayed. That's the way it stayed, as I recall, up until MMP. And what used to happen before MMP was every 5 years there would be what was called the Maori electoral option. And at that time, Maori could opt to be either on the Maori roll or on the general electoral roll. It was their choice. Now, a lot of Maori in those circumstances opted to go on the general roll because they said, well, the 4 Maori seats, they were always Labour from the 1930s, and they thought we might have a greater say in elections if we enrol in the general seats, particularly in the marginal ones which we could swing. So that's the way it was. And then with MMP, the system improved. And so the system said that, yes, there'll be the option every 5 years, but depending on the number of Maori who want to enrol in the Maori electorates, the number of Maori electorates will increase or fall. And they began to increase. They increased to 5, and then to 6, and then to 7. And it stabilised at 7. So that sort of wrote in, a bottom line of 7. There would always be a minimum of 7 Maori in the parliament, unless Maori themselves decide they want to change that. But with the list system as well, not only the Labour Party was then supplying the members of parliament in these early times of MMP, but the National Party was also having Maori on its list. This New Zealand First Party we've been talking about, a significant number of its members of parliament have been Maori. Winston Peters himself is Maori, and he's had quite a following in Maori, and is now at 72 or 73 seen as an elder. He does command some respect in the community. The Greens co-leader is Maori. She's not the first co-leader to be Maori. So across the political parties, Maori began to come in through the lists as well. And as I say, the representation now is at least equal to proportion of the population, but probably more. I haven't checked the latest stats. And Maori are a very significant force in the New Zealand Parliament. And there is caucusing across the parties. It's a very interesting dynamic. So without doubt, these changes have been beneficial to having strong Māori perspectives in the government and in the Parliament as a whole.
Thank you very much for the discussion. So I have 2 quick questions. The first is, I agree with your point about it being a difficult... Oh, Stan, sorry. Perhaps proportional representation, electoral reform is a difficult issue for people to digest if they're not necessarily politically active. I was inviting my friend to come tonight, and she said, okay, proportional representation, is that something we like or don't like? And she's very progressive, so I'm curious if you could give maybe an elevator pitch of what you would say the leading argument would be. If you had someone for 30 seconds to kind of try to convince them that it's important? And then secondly, just have you had any thoughts about the influence that Prime Minister Trudeau has on this referendum, given that he had made it an election issue last year and then dropped his support for proportional representation or electoral reform? Thank you.
I personally think the elevator pitch is that the range of political opinion in modern society is just too great to be easily corralled into two camps. And first past the post encourages a duopoly. It's very hard to break the duopoly. Even, as you can see in your own province, 17% get 3 seats. So it's not a fair outcome. So, if you proceed from there that, really, people deserve to have their votes represented in the parliament. Now, you set the 5% threshold to avoid the kind of Israeli and Italian-style proliferation of tiny, tiny parties. But, if you can get 5%, there's a case for you being in there as a party. Now, on the issue of, the Prime Minister of Federal Canada, I think what the Yes campaign could be saying is that British Columbia's got a chance to show Canada how to do this. Pride yourself on being leaders.
I want to just build you talked about what the main message is, and I agree with you. That's going to be what's most persuasive. But I'm also interested in hearing what you were able to do what you were able to achieve. You a very progressive agenda with a Labour government, because in British Columbia we have a situation where the Liberal Party is opposed, as you know, and the NDP and the Greens are in favour, and NDP and Green voters are by large majority in favor, Liberal voters mainly opposed. And so part of what we think we will be saying to people, in addition to the fairness arguments, and 40% shouldn't mean 100% of the power and so on, is look what we've been able to do with having a confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and the Greens. And we're doing our best to model good behavior and to show people that it can work. So I'm interested in knowing what you were able to do in your 9 years with minority government under proportional representation as far as a progressive agenda.
Well, yeah, I do think that the government here being seen to function well is going to be very important going through to the referendum, because in a sense you're a showcase for how governments will need to be. It's very unlikely under an MMP system that a single party will get an absolute majority of votes again. So an ability to work together collaboratively, do the consultation, be seen to get things through will be important. And from what I understand, and I have had breakfast with your Deputy Premier, and I said, tell me the things you've done. She reeled off the most incredible number of really progressive things that the government's been able to do. And so you've got a story to tell, that here we are, we're in effect operating under proportional representation conditions, and we've got some very, very good things through. For New Zealand, we did a lot. When I became PM, we still had a right of appeal to the Privy Council in London, which was somewhat outdated. We dealt with that. We actually said we had to leave before they threw us out, because the Privy Council was getting tired of hearing cases from the Dominions, as it were. And I knew, for me, the decisive argument was when a case involving Indigenous rights went to the Privy Council. And in New Zealand, an Indigenous group is an iwi, a tribe, an iwi. I think you say band sometimes, a range of terms. It's an iwi. And this case that went to the judges had one of these learned law lords saying, "And what exactly is an iwi?" That for me was just the end. We had to act. and we did. And we set up a New Zealand Supreme Court. Look, some of the most sort of progressive things we did were done on conscience votes. And we were one of the first to move on civil unions before gay marriage. You couldn't even talk about gay marriage really in 1999. It became very much, possible in later years. But we got through civil unions, which offered a parallel partnership. That was a conscience vote. We got through the decriminalisation of sex work as a conscience vote. Even major reforms on the child discipline issue, because I don't know whether Canada still allows parents to hit their children, but we took that defence out of the law, right? You cannot hit your children under New Zealand law now. In Scandinavia, they wonder what the fuss has always been about. But anyway, but that was quite an interesting exercise, because I had to, as Prime Minister, reach right across the aisle to the Leader of the Opposition to get that through. Yeah, so that, because New Zealand First didn't support it, and they were our confidence and supply partner. So I had to go right across the opposition. And they bought into it as being the right thing to do. We had major reforms in early childhood care and education. Every child became entitled to 20 hours free childcare a week. We extended annual holidays. We brought in paid parental leave for the first time ever in the term of our government. We brought in major new working for families cash transfers for families, which actually reached from the poorest families up into low middle incomes to ensure. In the old days, you used to have tax rates which reflected single, married plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, and that had all gone. And it was quite hard for families, so that was able to be legislated for. There was one of the first pieces of legislation we put in even before Christmas in 1999 was to raise the top tax rate, because the tax rates were too low. We campaigned on it. We were very transparent. We said we're going to do it. We did. We were able to reform the labour law, which had become much too deregulated. We brought it back to a better balance. So you could just really go through portfolio after portfolio and say this was a pioneering government. We passed our climate change legislation for carbon trading scheme back, I think, in the 2005 to 8 period. We ratified the Kyoto Protocol before Canada. There were progressive measures across the board.
This is going to be our last question.
Thank you. I not only appreciate the facts I'm learning from you, but I love your presentation, and you're doing it with a sense of joy. And we will win this campaign, not because we focus on the no's. There may be 100 no's, but we're going to focus on one yes. We're going to do it from our heart. We're going to do it with courage. The only thing to fear is fear itself, folks. And we're here because we want to have a better system. We deserve a better system. And let's do it, and let's have fun doing it. Thank you.
Well, my name's Dawn Black, and I'm a member of the board of the Broadbent Institute. And it's my pleasure tonight to thank Gary Mason for coming to participate with us tonight with his very incisive intellectual questions and deep questions. We appreciate it, Gary. Thank you very much for your time. And Helen Clark, we are delighted to have you here with us. Thank you so much for your time. I don't think I have to tell you how much it means to us. You can tell by the audience reaction to you being here, but it really has meant a great deal to all of us. It means a lot to our campaign. I think you'll give us some energy, too, to go forward with the people who spoke earlier about civil society participating in the campaign. And as you've heard tonight, this is our chance, folks. We've got to do it. Helen, also, I want to thank you for all you've done for women, not only in New Zealand, and I'll get emotional on this part. Sorry. but what you did with the UN, what you did in your own country, and what you did through the SI and SIW, and all of the work you've done to advance the cause of women in democracies and in societies across the world. Thank you very much. So on behalf of the Broadbent Institute, please stay. Please have some refreshments. Have a chance to say hello to Gary and to Helen. And thank you again, all of you, for coming.